Well, to unpack all these statistics and what the numbers look like for the DA this year, let's cross back to Sakina Kamwendo, who's with Mzwandile Mbeje, as well as Dr. Ronesh. SK, good morning to you again.
And welcome back. And you just came back as the sound behind us dipped from the stage. So bear with us because it might get slightly loud as Kurt Darren is going through his paces for later on today. But of course, I'm still with our SABC Politics Editor and our Head of Research, Dr. Ronesh, and of course, Mzwandile Mbeje. And Natasha was speaking to one of the leaders and he was basically saying, give us 5 years. Don't waste your vote on a party that has no track record of governance. And just to that point, if we look at this past week, we had a by-election in George, for example, in the Western Cape. And the DA really came in for a drubbing there at the hands of the Patriotic Alliance, who just about got double the votes that the DA got. So how do you see the fortunes of the DA and their track record of governance, especially in areas outside of the main centers in urban areas?
Well, I think that by-election told the story that we've been quite aware of, that as much as the DA has been strong in the Western Cape, so it is facing difficult challenges, particularly from the Patriotic Alliance. And that 5 years that they are requesting from South Africans to govern, it may not be easy because they also have the opportunity, South Africans have the opportunity to see where they've governed. The fact that the PA could be able to do what it did in the Western Cape, and you've been looking at the numbers, it's quite instructive as well. In fact, it also talks about what we've been speaking about, to say we've been looking at the ANC, perhaps everyone saying they'll be dipping below 50. The Western Cape, the DA is likely to also dip below 50 if you look at what is happening, particularly from the challenges of parties like the Patriotic Alliance, the Good, and then of course the global dynamics. The Israeli-Palestinian situation has affected that area quite big. There's a very strong sentiment from some people to say, well, we've entrusted these people with our votes, but clearly in terms of how they align with our belief systems may not be what we believe in.
Yeah. No, absolutely, fully agree, Mzwai. And, just going back to the by-elections, thus far between the November 2021 local government elections and the last by-election on, I think it was Valentine's Day, 14th of Feb, this Wednesday, there were around 50 by-election windows. Of those 50 by-election windows, as much as you're going to say that the DA has lost support in, particular wards, the DA, for most part of it, they've retained, 41 of those wards, wherever they contested. They initially lost 2 wards to the Good Party, Delil's Good Party, and they eventually clawed back, those 2 wards in George municipality, the same place where the Patriotic Alliance actually won. And if you look at the results of the 2021 local government elections, back then the DA scored around 37% of the vote. The turnout was about 37% as well. This time around, they kind of stayed static. They got around the same vote tally. But of course, the Patriotic Alliance was very visible on the ground. And that's why they came in, from absolutely nowhere, possibly double the vote what the DA had. They ran away with that ward with 63%, in that particular ward. I think it was Ward 8 in George municipality. But it's also about, being on the ground, being visible, connecting with people. And I think that's where the DA needs to improve. Because the DA is not a party that's known for campaigning door to door, like the ANC does, or hold these mass rallies and that kind of thing. The Patriotic Alliance, to a certain extent, is very much like the ANC in that sense, where they want to be among the people. And I think the DA can take a feather from, from the PA's cap, in terms of learning these lessons, how to campaign effectively, especially in wards, especially in ward by-elections, because that will also give you an indication of voter sentiment come the big elections like the 2024 one, possibly to be held in May this year.
And you are correct, Dr. Doraj. It is Ward 8 in the George municipality. Just incidentally, for those who didn't see those by-election results, so in Ward 8 in George, the Patriotic Alliance polled 1,272 votes, the Democratic Alliance 671, the ANC 50, and the EFF 34. So makes for quite instructive reading, especially going to your point earlier that the DA is very much a party that does well in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. So they would be concerned about some of these results, I would imagine.
In fact, there's a very interesting agreement between them and the IFP, particularly in KZN and Sakina, when it comes to the by-elections. So any of the two teams, of the two parties, when they contest a by-election, if let's say that by-election, the IFP is seen as the stronger contender there, so they'll step back. So same thing that they do as well. I've been seeing so the kind of that pattern that has been happening mainly in KZN. So it also makes it a bit difficult to then judge correctly the strength. But of course in the Western Cape it's something slightly different. So these are really things that will play themselves out in the national and provincial elections, because everyone for themselves there, so you're not stepping back for anyone. So but I hope the DA is saying, so if we are not doing very well, at least our partners, the pre-election pact partners, must do well, because that vote still becomes our vote.
But you see, that's a very interesting thing, because again, you know, the approach to this pact and how it's going to actually play out after the fact. Because let's say you have a scenario whereby, as it stands right now, the DA is expected to be the majority party in that pact. But if one of the others does unexpectedly well and better than they anticipated, how does that play out? What are John Steenhuisen's chances of being elected president for that multi-party pact, for example? What about someone like Sabisa from the IFP, who there somehow seems to be some sort of expectation that perhaps he should be the face there, but I don't know. How does all of this play out?
You know, it's quite interesting if you look and if you've been following what has been happening, Sakina. One of the founding principles of that multi-party charter was to say the official opposition, or I think the official opposition, yes, must be the leader of government business. So I know what currently happens to someone who's the leader of government business. So there appears to have been an unwritten agreement to say the majority party will not necessarily produce the president. Then comes the factor of the new players, like the one that is launching on Monday. So who knew about Roger Jardine a couple of months ago? So what is that factor? How is it playing itself out in that bigger scheme of things?
What is that factor? Who is Roger Jardine? How does that factor into this? Is this something that the DA should be having sleepless nights over?
You know, my main issue with that multi-party charter, Sakina, I'm being very honest, 8 parties comprise of, that MPC. But it's all good and well. You've got big parties like the DA, the Freedom Front Plus, Action SA, and a couple IFP as well. But there are a couple of smaller players there I've never even heard of. Who are those parties? Do they even have a constituency? So should those bigger parties win a huge portion of those votes come 2024, these elections, and these guys say that, we were equal partners, but the DA does not play that game. The DA does not, we've seen in the coalition agreements in, most of the major metros, the DA says, but, we dictate the terms.
But to be fair to them, they've been very clear about that.
So I think the DA needs to be a little more tolerant. If I'm a bigger player and you get less than the expected votes, I think that needs to be very clearly stipulated, because you cannot get a party that has 500 votes with 0.01% off that ballot and suddenly you're claiming an MEC position or, some other powerful position, within provincial government or, perhaps nationally as well.
I think this is the reason why they decided to contest separately, because they want to see the strength of each party. So if you are part of the multi-party charter, but you were not able to secure a seat, are you still relevant? It's not. It doesn't make sense, because it means you did not bring anything to the table. So we can't engage you on anything meaningfully, because you didn't bring anything to the table. So they have insisted that.
So what if you bring one seat, and that is the one determining seat?
It is then proportionate to who did others bring? How many votes or seats others brought in? So then you are able to engage with that particular individual. So I was coming into the Roger Jardine situation because as much as we are talking about voters making the call, so there are people who are funding these parties, and they have an interest. They have an interest in what becomes of our South Africa beyond the elections. So we do understand that, funders, because most of the funders, if you look at the funders of many of these parties, even smaller parties, so are the same people. So what is their interest? Yeah. So they sometimes would want someone who will be acceptable to them. I mean, the earlier engagements with the DA and Roger Jardine was to try and get him to be the face of the multi-party charter. But I don't think others were going to be acceptable to that. So there's a lot more that is playing out behind the scenes.
But why would anyone think that that would be acceptable to people who are entrenched in the game, people who actually do have a track record in the game? Why would someone who has no track record, as you asked the question very pertinently, Dr. Ronesh, someone whose constituency we can't even pin down, why should they yield to a proposition like that?
Yeah. I think, Sakina, very important for me, especially in elections of this nature, national, provincial, I think the operative word is leverage. Leverage, and the second most important word to me in politics is constituency. Going back to the Umkhonto weSizwe party with Jacob Zuma, we had by-elections a couple of days ago on, this Wednesday that went past. Zuma's main mission of that party is to split the ANC votes, and that's exactly what he did. Upongolo, Ward 4 it was. If you look at the detailed summary results from the IEC, the MK got 687, the ANC just above 800, and who snatched the award? It was the IFP with a combined total of, I think, about 1,200. Had you combined the MK's vote with the ANC, it would have amounted to 1,500, and the ANC would have taken that award in Upongolo. So Zuma's mission, again, who is Jacob Zuma? Jacob Zuma has a constituency behind his name. He's trading with that. There's no manifesto. Have you seen any policy of the MK? I haven't seen it.
No leadership as well?
No leadership as well. It's just Jacob Zuma. So, Zuma obviously is a very old man. He's not going to live forever. So what happens when Zuma is out of the equation? What happens to the MK party? Going back to my point, constituency and leverage. I think those are the two tradables in these elections that's going to prove very important, especially with the multi-party charter.
Also on the multi-party charter, one of the things that the Freedom Front Plus said very openly, they said, you know what, we are not stupid. South Africa is currently not ready for a white president. So that's why some of these areas, and then even the funders and the donors will try to look at all those people. So it's a lot more.
But has the DA accepted that? The Freedom Front Plus has. Has the DA really accepted that?
I think the DA will accept that if South Africans give it the outright majority. If they still don't give the DA the outright majority, it will be very difficult. So I think the Freedom Front Plus is very clear to say, yes, we want to get the ANC out of power, but currently I don't think South Africans are ready for the white president unless South Africans vote overwhelmingly for that.
And just to go back to what I was saying, I'm going back to what I said earlier about the Federal Council chairperson, Helen Zille, what she said. Winning the union buildings is not impossible, but it's indeed a long shot. So they know they do have a chance, especially with the MPC. They're part of that MPC. There is a chance, but for them, it's a long shot. That's why they are targeting especially three provinces: Gauteng, KZN, and notably the Western Cape. So the Western Cape, obviously, they'll take a bit of a hit with good Patriotic Alliance and obviously the Freedom Front Plus. But I think they're very strategic in KZN. Obviously, we've got Chris Papaste, who's the premier candidate for the DA. He speaks the language very fluently, isiZulu, in KZN. They're teaming up. This was an interview with, one of the media outlets recently. Helen Zille even said, we are going with the IFP. we're going to combine our votes in that province to pull down the ANC below that psychological 50%. Once we do that, then it's free for all, because remember, the NFP, the National Freedom Party, is weakened in that province. The other major player is obviously going to be the EFF and Zuma's MK party. So lots of political horse trading is going to happen, but I think if the DA and if the IFP do very well, especially the DA in eThekwini, the urban parts of KZN, and in the minority communities, there's a huge Indian population in KZN, especially all the Indian townships, Phoenix, Chatsworth, Pietermaritzburg, Kwaduguza, those kind of places. If they capture the minority vote, and the IFP obviously is very strong there as well, if they capture that minority vote and do very well in the urban areas, and then you juxtapose that with the IFP showing, especially in the rural areas, the northern parts of the province, then there is a possibility of the DA and an IFP coalition winning that province outright, going above that psychological 50% plus one. It can very, very possibly happen, yeah.
Indeed, it's a game of possibilities at this stage. It's election season, and this, of course, special broadcast coming to you from the Union Buildings. It is the second of our coverage of election manifestos, and it's the turn of the Democratic Alliance here in the nation's capital. And of course, looking over the Union Buildings here, this is, of course, where the march will culminate as the DA starts at Church Square, coming here to the seat of government at the Union Buildings. Interesting still, this particular place, because if we look at, again, just this week, it's been a very interesting week. So this week we heard Tshwane may have a few problems, and the DA has been in government here since 2016. It hasn't been great. It hasn't been a great showing, and the DA is always telling us about how well they govern where they do. How would you summarize their stint here in Tshwane?
I think the difficulty with Tshwane and the DA is that, it's been seen to be doing perhaps something in the affluent areas, so not so much in the townships. If you have been to places like Mamelodi and see some of the garbage there that's not being collected, so how do you then justify that you are where you govern well? So there have been a number of challenges. I'm not even going to speak about the well-known water situation in Hammanskraal. So somehow the DA has been battling here, and not only that, the Treasury had to take about the 2.4 billion back because they couldn't use it. And how can you not use some of the money when you have challenges? So clearly, I think that record will really be tested when it comes to things that are happening on the ground. Yes, perhaps you may have done better in the Western Cape, in some parts even there of the province. But here, you've been in power since 2016. So what differentiates you from, let's say, KZN, for example, eThekwini, from the ANC? They're having their own challenges with water as well. You are having your own challenges here. So it's really a long shot, this doc. You've put it so well.
Yeah.
And I suppose the DA could argue that, what's instructive about this and the situation in Tshwane is that they don't have an outright majority. So they've had these minority-led coalitions that they've been heading, and that's proven to be, quite a challenge. But then the same sort of allegations are leveled against the DA, even in the Western Cape, where it is said that they govern for the wealthy, for the affluent. And if you go to the townships, it's a completely different story. This is, of course, a narrative that the DA has to counter, Dr. Ronesh.
Yeah, just to go back to, what we spoke about earlier as well. The DA is very good in terms of, what Eusebius Makaiser once said. The DA is very sharp in putting out these data dumps. What do those figures mean? What do those AG reports mean? We've got clean audits, so what? Practically on the ground, what are we doing to improve the lives of the people that we're actually supposed to serve? In the Western Cape, like Mzwandile, the politics editor, as well as talking about Tshwane. You go to the townships here in Pretoria, in Tshwane. What differences have been made? Maybe there are slight differences here and there, but going back to that one bugbear, 30 years into democracy, we still see bucket toilets here in Tshwane as well, and in some of the other major areas, around the country. How is this possible 30 years after democracy? If you tell me, it was going to be outdone, in 2010 or somewhere thereabouts, I would have accepted that. But 30 years since 1994, and people still suffer that, inhumane, undignified way of actually relieving themselves, that is unacceptable. So just going back to that point as well, I think that's where the DA needs to actually improve itself. The DA needs to have the ear on the ground. I think that's what they're not doing. Maybe the leadership at the DA needs to change. Maybe the CEO needs to change, like what happened after the 2019 elections. I think they're tone deaf. They don't have the ear to the ground, and that's why they've been bleeding support since 2019. A bloodbath actually happened in 4 metros, 3 of Gauteng's metros, Ekurhuleni, Pretoria, Johannesburg, and especially obviously in Tshwane, and obviously the other 2 metros, Nelson Mandela Bay Metro. So 5 metros, a bloodbath actually happened for the DA. So they need to do something fast, and we've just a couple of months, towards the elections. There's still time. Just get your people out there, get strong leaders. Look at what the ANC does. The ANC's strong point is what? Rallies. It's door-to-door campaigning. They take all of the national leaders, all of the provincial leaders, not necessarily their local leaders, because the local leaders people don't know. And the ANC even complained about this in the SG reports. That's why our national and provincial leaders have to come down to ground level, because these guys are not doing their work. So the DA can learn from the ANC, from parties like the ANC, from the EFF, get their people out there, recruit strong leaders, and just push the DA's message. I think that is what's needed. And why Action SA did very well in 2021, the local government election, obviously they weren't around in 2019. The one factor that stood out for Action SA was visibility. You look at Herman Mashaba, Athol Trollop, and all the other leaders, they were very visible. All the taxi ranks, Bria and all parts of Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, and all those kind of places, they were absolutely visible. That's the thing the DA needs to do. You cannot sit in your offices, in your fancy, ivory towers and send out these reports and numbers. Who's interpreting those? Just journalists, people like us in the media who understand that kind of data. Translate that data. Translate the data for voters so they buy into that message of the DA. Yeah.
Well, looking at some of the polls that have been conducted, the Ipsos poll, for example, the DA vehemently disagrees with what that poll states. And of course, we'll come back and we'll talk more about that. We'll talk more about some of the policy propositions from the Democratic Alliance as well. But remember, the activities are starting from Church Square in the center here of Pretoria in Tshwane. So we're going to take you there now to our reporters, and it's just very, very noisy behind me. So let's take you to Church Square, and of course, studio will tell us who's there.